A lot of the sources for energy in the muscular system you're familiar with because it comes straight from biology. First and foremost, we know that ATP is the source of all energy. Now, what you need to remember is what ATP is used for within the muscular system, and that's the sodium-potassium pump. The second thing you need to remember, within the myofilament itself, the cocking of the myosin head and the detaching of the myosin from the actin, the breaking of that cross bridge. So for every turn of a single protein involved in the sodium-potassium pump, I use an ATP. For every myosin head, to cock that myosin head so that when it binds to actin and slides the actin forward, shortening the sarcomere, and then the detaching of that cross bridge and separating the myosin from the actin, we have 2 ATP for every single myosin head. So think about that. Think about the sheer amount of energy needed just to set up our electrochemical gradient and just for the actual action of contraction, keeping in mind how many myosin heads we have within a single sarcomere, how many sarcomeres within a single myofibril, and how many muscle fibers, which are our cells, within a single muscle. So the amount of ATP needed is astounding. Now, notice that we break our ATP bonds to ultimately release energy, and we go from ATP to ADP. So remember that I go from ATP to ADP, and that breaking is what releases my energy. And that's what they're showing you here. We go from ADP, ATP, which is tri, to di, and our inorganic phosphate. So when we do that, we ultimately release energy. And this is what's used for the any kind of initial burst of energy. We use all of our ATP within the cells before we use anything else. Now, once all of the ATP has been used up, then we go to creatine phosphate. Okay, so let's back up. Think of ATP as ones. So you need a few ones in your wallet. It's easy to spend them, makes it, they're handy, but you don't want to keep 20 ones in your wallet. Well, that's where creatine phosphate comes in. ATP is too hard to store within the cell, so we use creatine phosphate. What creatine phosphate does is it lets us replenish some of the ADP to form ATP so that we can use it again. And that's what creatine phosphate does, is it allows us to convert our ADP back to ATP and we can use it. And so now we have a second source of energy. Now, as we talk about this, keep in mind what we're talking about is when you first start exercising, we have to use energy for that. So we use up all of the ATP. Now we've used up all the ATP. Now we're going to go to creatine phosphate. Notice it calls it direct phosphorylation. Phosphorylation simply refers to the addition of this phosphate back to the ADP so that we can produce our ATP. Okay? Now, notice how quickly we utilize all of this. Now, where you see creatine phosphate, you hear creatine phosphate is one of the common supplements out there. You have to make sure you follow the directions. What it tends to do in terms of energy is it supplies extra creatine to your cells, but it also causes your cells to store more water. And when you start messing with the water level in your cells, you have the potential to start messing with the electrolyte levels, which could lead to some serious complications. That's why you always have to make sure you follow the directions associated with any supplementation. But back to the point here. Creatine phosphate simply gives us a second source of energy. Notice the rough duration. So now we move into the first part of cellular respiration, which you all know is glycolysis. Now, the main point, again, that I want you guys to remember, it's anaerobic. Okay, if glycolysis is anaerobic, that means it's occurring within the cytoplasm. Oxygen is not needed. And basically, we're simply breaking down glucose into pyruvic acid or pyruvate. And pyruvate has 2 choices. So notice here they're showing you pyruvic acid to lactic acid. We're going to talk about that. That's our fermentation process. But it's also, pyruvate is also where we can go into aerobic respiration. So pyruvate is kind of our joining point between cellular respiration as you know it in biology and where we either go aerobic or anaerobic. And so pyruvate's that dividing line. Again, notice here we get 30 to 60 seconds. In other words, we have adequate glucose within our cells capable of producing another 30 to 60 seconds of energy. So recognize what we're talking about. When you first start exercising, Notice how much energy we've used up in just that little bit of time. So we are dealing with, within probably the first 2 minutes of exercise, we're using up a lot of the energy that was stored in our cells. All right, so now, as long as we are still in an anaerobic environment, in other words, inadequate oxygen, we go into what's known as fermentation, and that's where we produce lactic acid. Now, lactic acid is, the production of lactic acid simply allows glycolysis to continue. So as long as we produce lactic acid, we can keep this process going, okay? And that's the sole reason we have lactic acid, is it recycles certain chemicals that we need for glycolysis. If we didn't produce lactic acid, we'd be done, we'd stop. But this allows us to keep going. Now, the important amount here is that we need huge amounts of glucose for this to continue. And this is where we see the next step, or the consequences of fermentation and lactic acid production, is we have to get glucose from our liver. And glucose is stored in our liver in the form of glycogen. Now, as we increase the amount of lactic acid, in other words, we're still in an anaerobic environment, so as the amount of lactic acid, as that concentration of lactic acid increases, typically we're going to have some muscle fatigue. And think about it, we talked about this in terms of proteins and protein action. Remember that proteins are impacted by things binding to it. Protein shape determines function. So if things bind to the protein and they transform the shape, we change the function. Remember back in biology that acids and temperature had an impact on protein function, because the acid interferes with that three-dimensional shape, because it's going to change the inherent attractions within the protein that give it its shape. So the presence of an acid can disrupt that. So the result of increased lactic acid is typically increased fatigue. Now, this leads to, it's the presence of the lactic acid, though, that causes the liver to release glucose, because what happens is we see a buildup of lactic acid. Lactic acid literally leaves or bleeds from the muscle cell, gets into the blood. When the blood with lactic acid hits the liver, it triggers the liver to release more glucose, to break down glycogen, release glucose. The glucose is in our blood, it starts traveling, gets delivered to our muscle cells, so we have an adequate source of energy to keep this process going. Because as long as we're exercising, again, think back to how much ATP we're using, it's a tremendous amount, so we have to keep this going. Now, this fatigue is what we lead to in terms of oxygen debt. Now, oxygen debt is actually why you keep panting even after you've finished exercising. Remember when we did the homeostasis lab and we were talking about homeostatic mechanisms, and so you're exercising, that increased level of exercise caused your muscles to utilize glycogen and break it down into glucose, which then produces pyruvic acid, which then produces lactic acid, and then we go all the way back, and that we cause this triggering. Well, long after you were done exercising, your muscles no longer needed the glycogen. They no longer need the glucose. They're not contracting, so the ATP requirements have drastically reduced, but you're still panting. And what your body is doing is paying off the oxygen debt. You are trying to basically take the lactic acid and convert it back into pyruvic acid, which can then be converted back into glucose, which can then be converted back into glycogen. What we're doing ultimately with the oxygen debt is we're trying to restore the glycogen levels within the liver. And so when we do that, we have to keep oxygen coming in, so we keep panting in order to metabolize the lactic acid back. This is also why a cool down is important after exercise. It gives your body a chance to pay off the oxygen debt. Now, as soon as we enter aerobic, in other words, now I have adequate oxygen, this all occurs, remember that aerobic respiration all occurs within the mitochondria. So this is where we see the Krebs cycle, you have the electron transport chain, all of that jazz. The main thing here is to remember that the aerobic mechanism is far more efficient. Look how much ATP we get from it. So as long as we hit the aerobic respiration component of our energy system, we start producing lots of ATP. But this is a very slow mechanism compared to our anaerobic process. And that's why the anaerobic has to carry us for so long before the aerobic kicks in. Now, Basically, going back to biology, oxygen is our final electron acceptor. Basically what happens, remember, we have hydrogen ions, and the hydrogen ions form with the oxygen. We have electrons in there, and it's the hydrogen ions and the oxygen and the extra electrons that form our H2O. So this is really why oxygen is required for respiration. This is really why we're considered aerobes, is we have to have oxygen to accept those electrons so that we can produce ATP. So the secondary reason we really care about our energy mechanisms is how we adapt to exercise. And one of those primary adaptations is going to be endurance. And we see this in terms of muscle metabolism. It becomes more efficient. You see this evidenced by your heartbeat, the heart rate. In athletes, some athletes can have a heart rate or a number of heartbeats per minute as low as 40. And it has to do with how their body is responding to the oxygen levels and what they have. And so the fitter you are, typically the slower your heartbeat. We also see this in terms of the changes to the actual muscles. Now, this is where you actually get a little bit of conflict or disagreement within when you look at research associated with muscles. There's a big question as to how much is damage. So you have little micro tears within the muscle fibers as you try to increase your strength. So, as you increase the amount you're lifting, you cause little micro tears, and it's the healing of those micro tears that actually leads to increasing muscle size, because obviously you have to have more protein because you're putting more stress on the muscle, et cetera, and or the other mechanism that could cause an increase in muscle size. The thing to remember is when we talk about adaptation, we're not increasing the number of muscle fibers. Muscle cells are amitotic. They do not divide. But we know their size increases, meaning we can increase the number of proteins or myofilaments within a particular muscle cell. And that has to do with increased use. Okay, and that's what we call hypertrophy, is you're just simply increasing the size of the muscle. Ultimately, when we talk about energy use, that's the thing to keep in mind, is we're going from aerobic and anaerobic, and the whole point goes back to how much we use within the sodium-potassium pump and just each individual muscle cell's contraction.